Today, we're diving into the incredible biology of the stressed brain. We're going to look at how stress isn't just a feeling, but something that physically reshapes your mood at a chemical level. I mean, we've all been there, right? That racing heart, the foggy thoughts, that crushing feeling of being overwhelmed. You know stress when you feel it. But have you ever stopped to wonder if it's doing something more than just making you feel bad in the moment? Well, it turns out the science is crystal clear. It is. Stress is a powerful physical force that is actively rewiring the chemistry and the very architecture of your brain. So let's get into exactly how that happens. Okay, so first things first, we need to understand what stress is from a biological point of view. How does some external thing, a looming deadline or a tough conversation, actually transform into that physical feeling inside you? Well, at its core, stress is basically anything that knocks your body out of its natural, stable state. Scientists have a great word for this: homeostasis. And the stress response? That's just your body's all-out effort to get back to that balance. It's a pure survival mechanism. To pull this off, your body has a sort of primary command chain. So let's meet the first key player in our story, the body's own emergency alarm system. This system is called the hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis, or let's just call it the HPA axis, way easier. When some kind of stressor hits, it kicks off this chain reaction you can see here. The brain signals the pituitary gland, which then signals the adrenal glands to basically flood your body with stress hormones. Let's break that down, because it's really just a simple three-step chemical conversation. First, the hypothalamus releases a hormone called CRH. That's the message to the pituitary to release its hormone, ACTH. And then ACTH is the final signal for the adrenal glands, which, fun fact, sit right on top of your kidneys, to release the main event, glucocorticoids. Those are your stress hormones. So, with all these hormones flying around, how does the body actually listen for them? Well, it uses two completely different kinds of receivers. On the left, you've got the MR receptors. Think of these as a super sensitive satellite dish. They're always on, just managing your day-to-day balance. But on the right, you have the GR receptors. These guys are more like an emergency broadcast tower. They only really kick into gear during high-stress situations to sound the alarm. Okay, so that's our emergency alarm system. Player one is on the board. Now, let's meet player number two, what we can think of as the brain's mood thermostat, the serotonin system. I mean, serotonin is probably the most famous neurotransmitter out there, and for good reason. It's a master regulator. It influences pretty much everything, from your mood and anxiety levels to your sleep and even your appetite. It's basically responsible for setting the entire emotional tone of your brain. Now, for our story to make sense, we've got to focus on one very specific type of serotonin receiver, the 5-HT1A receptor. And it has this really cool dual role. On the cells that make serotonin, it acts like a brake pedal, controlling how much gets released. But then in other parts of the brain, it acts as the receiver that actually picks up the mood signal. So it's a brake and a gas pedal all in one. And now we get to the heart of it. What happens when player one, the emergency alarm system, starts talking directly to player two, the mood thermostat? This is where everything connects. See, these two systems don't operate in different worlds. They actually have a meeting point. It's a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is absolutely critical for mood and memory. And as you can see in these images from the research, the hippocampus is just jam-packed with those stress hormone receivers. And it's super rich in those 5-HT1A serotonin receivers. It is the perfect place for these two systems to have a chat. And here is the single most important point of this whole explainer. When that stress alarm goes off, that flood of hormones doesn't just manage the emergency. It flows straight into the hippocampus and directly tells the serotonin system to power down. And you can literally see the result in the data from the study. Look at the top graph. That's a normal neuron firing away in response to a serotonin signal. Now compare that to the bottom graph, which is from a brain that's been exposed to chronic stress. See how that response is just blunted? The signal is so much weaker. Stress has effectively turned down the volume on serotonin. So how does it do this? Well, it gets right down to the genetic level. The stress hormones, the corticosteroids, they travel into the nucleus of your brain cells, and they literally interfere with the gene that is responsible for building those 5-HT1A serotonin receptors. In other words, stress tells your brain to build fewer antennas for its own mood-regulating signals. And this, right here, brings us to the biology of depression. If a single stressful event can turn down the volume, what happens when chronic stress leaves that alarm bell ringing constantly. Well, you get a cascade of consequences. The stress alarm, the HPA axis, it gets stuck in the on position. Your serotonin system gets completely thrown out of whack. The function of those critical 5-HT1A receptors plummets. Your brain even starts producing less of its own growth factors. And over time, this can lead to a measurable shrinking of the hippocampus itself. This is the physical signature that chronic stress leaves on the brain. Now, this also gives us this amazing insight into why antidepressants like SSRIs can take weeks to start working. They don't just magically boost serotonin. At first, by flooding the system with serotonin, they paradoxically push that brake pedal we talked about even harder. But over time, with that constant pressure, the brake system itself just gets worn out and desensitized. And once the brakes start to fail, then serotonin levels can finally rise, boosting the signal where it's needed most. So, does this mean the damage is permanent? Well, not necessarily. And this brings us to the final and maybe the most hopeful part of our story, the brain's incredible ability to change, a concept known as neuroplasticity. As the researchers themselves state, these physical changes to the brain's ability to grow new connections, its neuroplasticity, are what actually underlies the symptoms, which confirms that the brain isn't some static block of concrete. It is constantly being shaped and reshaped by our experiences. And that leaves us with one final really powerful question. We've just seen the clear biological evidence for how stress can physically rewire our brains for the worse. So think about what that implies about the power of things that do the opposite. What therapies, what habits, what experiences have the power to change our brains for the better? That is the challenge and the incredible promise that this science leaves us with.